we are heading now is back to the GDPR and preparing for cyber and data security obligations. And will you please welcome your moderator for that discussion, Ryan Meade.
Thanks, Anton. As Anton said, I'm going to be moderating this panel on GDPR. I decided not to speculate on why this is the one panel that neither Anton nor Paul wanted to moderate. Not sure what it is about it, but we have a very, very expert panel joining me on the stage now. We have Bryan McCarthy from Ronan, Daly, Jermyn. We have Dave Allen from Palo Alto Networks. Jason Burns from IBM. And David Clarke from vCISO. And please give them all a very big welcome. So, gentlemen, it's all gentlemen, I'm afraid, but you're very welcome. As I said to you before, I have done some work on GDPR in the kind of influencing phase with clients, but that sort of influencing and pleading phase is now over. There's no point in... Sorry, excuse me, I missed a panelist there. Ross.
I'm late to the party.
Ross Baker. Okay, delighted to have you with us. But any sort of chance of pleading for changes to the GDPR and so on are over. It's now in a phase of implementation and compliance. So I think the conversation just now will really be about the information security elements of getting ready for the big date in May 2018. So, Bryan, I'd like to go to you first. Maybe I know you talked through GDPR this morning, but the question really is, why now? Why is Europe embarking on this pretty major overhaul of its data protection and privacy regime at this point in time? And what are the main changes that are going to come in?
Well, it is a major overhaul, Ryan, because there are a couple of major issues. So, anybody who's dealing with the processing of personal data across member states will know currently just how fragmented the personal data legal landscape looks like. And without wanting to get too technical too early, the original Data Protection Directive back from 1995 is the basis on which all of the Irish law is based at present, and also the laws of other member states as well. And the key there is that it was a directive, so it required the individual member states to essentially adopt its own legislation in order to implement it as a matter of the national law. The GDPR is slightly different. The GDPR is a regulation, and by virtue of it being a regulation, it has what's known as direct effect. So it will directly apply to all of the member states. And that's done with one reason in mind, and that is to create a strong, coherent, unified digital landscape for the purposes of data protection. So fragmentation is one. It's an aim to create uniformity, and it's expressed as part of the GDPR that's designed to increase business development and have a general boost to economic growth. The second point is that I think, even from a legal perspective, without even dipping the toes into the technological side of things, back in 1995 when the first directive came out, I don't think anybody could have envisaged the scale of data collection and data processing that we're faced with today. And on the back of that, what would have been a fairly rudimentary set of rights and indeed obligations on businesses, it's been fairly apparent for years that they've needed a bit of a kick up the derriere in order to make it more fit for purpose. So it's fragmentation on the one hand and actually making it fit for purpose on the other.
So do you think that it will actually have real benefits for citizens and for consumers when it's rolled out?
I think it will. That's certainly the intention, I suppose. Like most good lawmakers, that's always what they try to do. Everybody seems to be, when they're discussing the rights of individuals, they're championing these new rights. Personally speaking, I think actually with all of the extra rules and regulations that a lot of these are going to be passed on to the consumers, to the individuals. I think there's going to be a lot more red tape, that they'll find it a little bit more cumbersome, a bit burdensome to actually go about what they up until now were doing by just clicking away.
Okay. Well, that leads nicely onto the question of, well, what are the main challenges that particularly organizations and businesses are going to face when dealing with implementation, and can any of those be turned into opportunities? Jason, we had a quick chat about this beforehand.
Yeah, we did, and yeah, I would take, I suppose maybe I'd take a slightly more rose-tinted view of GDPR. I mean, it does sound very much like it is an EU regulation, and it's something that everybody, and there's this countdown to May 2018. But I suppose from talking to customers, like with a lot of these things, there's a difference, I think, actually with GDPR compared to other regulations, and there was a reason why it took so long for it to get there. My view is that I think it is a good thing. I can understand the red tape issue, but the principles behind it, in terms of protecting, it's all our data, you know, and the same way we have very tight regulations about placing our money in a bank. It's our money. It just happens that the bank is looking after it on our behalf. Data is starting to be seen in that way. It's a huge money spinner for most companies. So I think data and analytics, and I'm coming from a data background, but you know, data analytics are here to stay, and with the advent of artificial intelligence and the machine learning advances, you know, putting down a kind of a marker to say, look guys, here are the principles. There's very little reference to technology in GDPR. What they're saying is, you know, these are the kind of fundamental rights. They'll be subject to change, but we want everybody to treat people's data with the kind of the respect that is there, because it is each individual's data.
Personal data. So the idea, I guess, is that citizens will have confidence that, or some level of confidence that organizations are putting the processes in place to, whatever they're doing with your data, there is some regime in place.
Yeah,
but obviously it does present a difficulty for organizations of different sizes. And Dave, you mentioned small businesses. I mean, obviously there are global businesses that have massive supply chains and security sectors and so on. But you know, this is a regulation that's going to apply more or less universally. What can small businesses in particular do to meet the compliance challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality of GDPR, it is universal, right? So as a regulation, it's applying everywhere. There are some differences in what applies. There are some exemptions for smaller firms, sub 250 employees, where potentially they don't have to have a data protection officer if you're not processing, you know, high amounts of personal data. There are, you know, some other elements around things you may or may not need to do in terms of auditing and validating all the processes and such like. I think the reality, though, is in terms of the preparation for GDPR, I think the onus is pretty similar, which is you need to know your business, you need to know what data you're holding and how you're processing it and what your workflows are, be they electronic or manual workflows in terms of how you're handling personal information. I think on the other side of it, though, certainly something that came up in another session recently in London I was in, was people saying that there's this perception that amongst the many things that we've talked through today, many of the technologies, that these are inaccessible for the smaller firms. And I think I would challenge that and say that in reality that they're not. As a technology company, you know, the reality is that all of the capabilities, certainly the prevention side of things that I talked about this morning, are genuinely available for literally a few $1,000s to a small firm, and it gives all the same implications, all the same protections, all the same visibilities as will give the larger firm. Clearly, your ability to consume those and use those may vary a little bit depending on your setup. But you know, so there's two elements. I think a lot of the technology is available. You can consume it either, you know, directly or through the cloud, the various other things we've talked about in some of the themes today. But that preparation, that audit workflow and things, I mean, those are things that even the small firms are going to have to make their own determinations on what kind of data am I running. And I think just to pick up on the date thing, I think the hashback to 1995 was always interesting. Those here this morning, I like little mini history lessons. Think what were you doing in 1995? And things that were mentioned earlier by like Sir Mark Wilson. So the USB key, Universal Serial Bus, or as we like to think of it in cyber world, the University Simple Breach Tool. That came out, right? Amazon opened its doors for the first time. We were still doing Java 1, and only 4 years later, Scott McNealy, then president of Sun at the time, said, privacy is dead, get over it. That was 17 years ago. So lots of change.
Okay, well, you're doing a great job here of leading on to my next question, which is about change and the fact that this is a regulation that's been set now, which is hopefully going to last us for a number of years. And as part of that, certain things have been left somewhat undefined or as an exercise to the reader, particularly the question of the state of the art. How do you make sure that you're keeping up with the state of the art, or that you can demonstrate that your systems are in line with that when it's not really defined? And are there any other grey areas in the directive we need to know about?
I think it's kind of an interesting question, and kind of going back to kind of Dave and Jason. I think IT's kind of grown up with GDPR. It's kind of coming of age. When electricity first came out, you had bare wires. People got killed and injured, and it was, well, that's kind of a cost of doing business. Things hurt, you get injured. Same thing with cars, planes. Nuclear industry is kind of heavily regulated. The building industry is heavily regulated. You cannot have an architect put up a building without going through planning, without going through building control. Kind of same's happening now with IT. We're kind of catching up with the rest of the world. Actually, you cannot build unsafe IT. And I think that's kind of where GDPR sort of fits in. It kind of talked about grey areas, which is interesting. I was talking to an anonymous person just before this started. Actually, it was Dave. And he said...
There's a data breach right there.
Yeah, and absolutely a data breach. Well, there's only 2 of us, so I think we can kind of anonymise that. And he said, this is a privacy regulation. Okay, yeah, it kind of is a privacy regulation, but the word privacy in the GDPR regulation is mentioned twice. The title is not general privacy regulation, it's general data protection regulation. So yeah, privacy is involved, but the bottom line is it's about data protection. And you're talking about grey areas. Interestingly, if you do another search on the regulation, any word beginning with like, which however you want to take that, kind of means that there's not certainty on it, I think is mentioned 43 times, which means there's potentially 43 areas where there are grey areas, and that's just the starting point. I'm always reminded of that phrase. I don't know if any of you remember The Prisoner from the 1960s. I am not a number, I am a free man. And I think kind of my conclusion at the moment is I am a number. Most of the stuff I do, if you do it with your mobile phone, you are a number. There was a recent case, I think it was in Germany, yeah, where they said IP addresses are potentially identifiers. I'm a number again. So my kind of whole life is kind of regulated by I'm a number, and is that personal data? And talking about grey areas, well, everybody has a website, everyone has weblogs, everyone kind of generally as a matter of security, you want to know where the IP address is coming from. I think that's kind of a grey area, because how do you manage that? How do you actually deal with that? Because actually, you know what? I want to put that IP into my Google Analytics. Great, so now my...
Okay, I want to sort of run with that theme, and Ross, you're very welcome. I know your colleague Rick was not able to join us, but that very question that David raises, is this about privacy or is it about security?
Well, first of all, going back to some of the comments that have been made before, we have an obligation to the consumer at the end of the day. And if I'm a customer of, say, TalkTalk, and they've breached and they've lost my data, I'd like to know about that. Now, whether it needs to be in the public domain or not, I don't know. But to the point about the grey areas as well, a lot of my customers have said, well, Ross, Trend Micro, you make the software, I've bought your software, I must be GDPR ready. And of course they're not, because have they actually deployed it? You're not a customer until it's deployed. And even if they've deployed it, have they made sense of the logs that our product generates? The breach that most interests me regarding this is Target in the States. They had a product. They were breached still because the people there didn't know what they were doing with the information. So again, privacy, I've got a 12-year-old son who doesn't know what privacy means because he's of the generation where everything is online. Whereas to me and our generation, that's very different, and privacy to us means something different. So it's, what's the definition of sensitivity? What's the definition of privacy? What's the definition of state-of-the-art technology? We're vendors of solutions. Is ours state-of-the-art, or is theirs more state-of-the-art? Is ours less? So the grey areas here, that for me is going to be the biggest interest, because it's, 443 days to go? Yeah,
it's not a long time. In fact, it's a huge topic to cover, and I know we don't have a huge amount of time, but that question, though, about, to what extent is this a technology issue and to what extent it's a data governance issue, I think is really important. I mean, we touched on social engineering in the context of security earlier, but what are the kind of social aspects of this or the organizational aspects of this that really need to be addressed? I don't know whether Jason or Dave, you want to...
Yeah, so like I said, I'm kind of coming at it from a data as opposed to strictly security, but I mean, there's like a Venn diagram, there's lots of overlapping areas there, so you can't really have one without the other. But governance and lineage and all these kind of phrases. I mean, these are areas that have been around a long time, that kind of management of metadata and stuff like that. And now with the advent, I think where tools come in and automation comes in, definitely on the data side of things, and people are, I suppose, sick of the kind of the trite phrase big data, and all that, but it is that amount of data that is just big enough that it's hard to manage without automation in place. So the idea that you can instill some form of privacy and security and all that with the scale of the data that's in place, when you mightn't even, the kind of the Rumsfeld thing of the known knowns and the unknown, there's a lot of stuff that you might be very, very confident on, and then other areas that unstructured that you're not,
Thanks. Bryan, I'll let you come in very briefly, then we'll see if we have time for some questions from the floor.
Just quickly, Ryan, and I think we've touched on it actually in terms of the governance piece, and I certainly would see it very much as the security element being part of the overall requirement. So we talk about the new obligations, but actually most of them are around already. I mean, the Irish data protection laws have been in place for years now, and on the security point and the technology point, I mean, that's one piece of a much bigger jigsaw. There are other low-hanging fruit. I mean, there's a whole cultural shift that needs to take place in some organizations. That people seem to think that GDPR privacy, it's all brand new, but actually it's not at all. And it can be really, really simple. I mean, some of the basic actions you can take actually don't cost a penny at all. You can stick a notice in the canteen saying, turn your files over at night, scribble out a quick clean desk policy, little things like that. Yeah. It's about raising awareness.
Yeah, I think it's really important people not to get the message this is something that's just so challenging they shouldn't even face up to it. There are well,
it'll cost you to do things, there's no doubt about it, but it'll cost you more not to do them.
Can I dive in there?
Yeah, I'll let you dive in quickly.
There's an example on the ICO website of what a GDPR breach looks like, and I'm paraphrasing here. It goes, a hospital worker looks at the wrong record, and they regard that as a disclosure breach. And you go, well, okay, kind of how hard can that be to handle? And then when you actually think it through, you go, hospital, 200 employees, 50 systems, 10,000 records. You've now got 100 million data points to manage. How are you going to manage that? If you manage that to within 1%, there's 1 million data points you haven't covered. So it does become a kind of big data technology problem to fix, although it kind of sounds easy.
Okay, great. I'd love to get some questions from the floor if there are any, or even comments. Surely. Yes. Down here at the front, second from the front.
Yeah, it's just a point around, is it about data or is it about privacy? And something you touched on earlier, Bryan, when you were talking about your clients in the healthcare and education sectors in particular, and children. So, now when I hear that the age is 16 for a child to be able to give their consent, and that it's possible for it to be as low as 13, I think that's really shocking. But I could imagine in 10 years' time, actually, the 16-year-olds of today thinking actually 13 is actually quite acceptable. And we're talking now about putting in place systems for the GDPR in 2018. And I just wonder, how robust is it going to be, and will we be revisiting it again in 5-10 years' time?
Well, the children's digital age of consent is actually one of the very few areas within the regulation that actually allows the member state to legislate for themselves. So as I mentioned earlier this morning, one of the first consultations that the state has was in relation to the digital age of consent. And yesterday the Department of Justice published their priority list, and top of that list is introducing the new data protection bill, which will deal with the digital age of consent. There are other elements as well that will also be covered off.
Are there any other significant elements that will be covered by national legislation?
Well, digital age of consent, in my mind, is top of the list. There's also an ability, up until now, Irish data protection law has essentially said doesn't apply to deceased individuals. Under GDPR, a member state can legislate to include deceased individuals within the remit of personal data and all of the rights that are associated with that. And that, in my mind, sets off whatever about my client's mind sets off a few alarm bells running. There are also various provisions in relation to AI, data processor, sub-processing arrangements, but it's a very finite number. And back to the point originally, the aim here is to set up a uniform, homogeneous, coherent regime, not to have it splintering off again.
But I guess the question then is will this be revisited again?
Well, I think there's another side of the coin. Obviously, children have got to be protected. I've got 3 children, so I'm kind of fully for it. But I think, is this also a way of restricting children access to the internet for certain knowledge? I haven't got a good example off the top of my head, but say a 13-year-old wanted to find out information about alcohol abuse in their parents. That means they cannot log onto a site without parental consent to find that information. So I think it could be a double-edged sword.
Okay, I think as you can see that our time is up, but it's a ridiculously short amount of time to try to cover everything that's in the GDPR. But just in the very brief time we have available, does anybody want to make any final comments?
Well, yeah, I'd like to answer that other guy's question from earlier, where a third party.
I'll come back to
yeah.
It was just like I said, a lot of people are at the stage of just trying to interpret what to do and all that. But what we would see, particularly customers with large data sets, is just get started. You know, it's like people who want to get into analytics will just get started. You know.
Okay, Dave, one sentence or?
Yeah, well, so I think 2 things. One, get started because the deadline's not going to move. And the other thing, almost picking on the data privacy laws and what goes on over time, is state of the art is deliberately phrased in that way to be timeless. So one of the other things you've got to think about when you do GDPR, you won't just do GDPR.
You'll
so what's the ongoing model for that? What's your evaluation? And check out the IDC white paper, state-of-the-art paradox, if you want to get a view on that.
We'll be doing GDPR for many years to come. Ross, did you have anything else to say?
I would just end with, don't panic. It is coming. Don't forget, you could smoke on the London Underground until it burnt down tragically, and then something had to happen. So actually, this happening now is just a natural evolution. Don't panic, but start with education, because for me, that's the biggest issue.
Great. And final word to you, David.
Yeah, the third-party supply chain, absolute nightmare, especially with Android.
Okay, well, I think that's been really interesting. If possibly, you know, we could go on for a bit longer, but just like to ask you all to give a big hand to our panelists today. Thank you.